Hello and welcome to The World Deciphered, brought to you by the Cipher Brief. I'm your host, Suzanne Kelly. In this week's show, we're talking about Salt Typhoon, the cyber breach of U.S. telecommunications companies that U.S. officials believe is linked to Beijing. It's been 6 months since the breach was detected, and hackers are still believed to be in some of the systems that were targeted. We're talking with the director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, Jen Easterly, about that. Plus, we told you last week about those pesky drones that have been spotted over New Jersey. We'll have more on why that's concerning for national security experts. Let's check in first, though, with Cipher Brief Managing Editor Tom Nagorski in New York for a look at the other stories topping the headlines at the Cipher Brief this week. Tom?
Well, Suzanne, in some ways we pick up exactly where we left off last week with the aftershocks of the Syrian rebellion. There are signs of a return to normalcy. The rebel coalition has named a transition leader. We've seen the restoration of some government services, and no major unrest or violence in the wake of the stunningly fast overthrow of the Assad regime. And the United States now says it's in talks with the rebels, urging them to make good on their pledges to reject extremism. That said, it is early, of course, and there are signs of other factions and rebel groups angling for power in different parts of the country. There's already been heavy involvement by two of Syria's powerful neighbors. Israel has occupied territory in southern Syria and carried out airstrikes against many Syrian military facilities. And Turkey has made it clear it wants to eliminate Kurdish rebel forces in northern Syria, some of which are allied with the U.S. Meanwhile, lurking under all of this are fears of a new civil war between the various factions and the possibility that terrorist groups will take advantage of the power vacuum. Just a couple of other items to note this week. European leaders are holding talks on the future of what's called the Joint Expeditionary Force. That's the group made up of 10 NATO member nations, and it's meant to be a kind of rapid reaction military force against a hostile threat. The main focus there, of course, is Russia, which threatens Europe on an almost regular basis these days, and the concern that the U.S. is going to be less reliable in a European crisis once Donald Trump returns to the White House. And lastly, a note about those objects up in the sky. For nearly a month, people in parts of New Jersey have been fascinated or frightened by flickering lights they're looking at up in the night sky. Now there have been sightings in other parts of the Northeast. U.S. officials have said some of these are probably drones, which only recently were cleared for night flight. Some may be small aircraft. And basically they're saying no big cause for concern. Well, that hasn't satisfied a lot of people who live in these places and who have been seeing these things in the sky. And even President-elect Donald Trump jumped into the fray. He said the government must know what the objects are, and he posted on Truth Social, quote, "Let the public know and now, otherwise shoot them down." We'll leave it there, Suzanne.
Thank you, Tom. Back to that drone story for just a minute, though. It boggles my mind that this many sightings can be recorded and that officials say they still don't know where these drones are coming from. And that's certainly highlighting potential national security issues, even though authorities say they aren't worried about that in this particular case. We spoke with Beth Sanner, who was the president's daily briefer under the first President Trump, about just why these drone sightings in New Jersey are so concerning for national security experts. Beth Sanner, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Suzanne. Great to see you.
It's great to see you as well. It seems the U.S. has a real problem with drones.
Yeah, I mean, I shouldn't laugh, but it does seem a little Keystone Cop-ish, doesn't it? It doesn't
really
feel
does. It really does. It feels like, especially too, with all of the attention that's been focused on drone development and technology over the years, this isn't, something that no one would have thought about, right? I think that's the real head scratcher for those of us sort of out there in the private sector. How did this get missed that they don't know where these things are coming from? Can you kind of break it down for us a little bit, like how you see it?
Yeah, well, I think that one of the things is that everybody has been so excited about drones that they kind of forgot that actually counter drones are more important in some ways, right? So we're just not focused on that, and we need to be, and so we have a lot of a technology on that, and our counter drone technology first is just hard. It is
Yeah.
not straightforward, the kind of technology used. And we can see a lot of adaptation in Ukraine, which you have been to and seen that, but like that's a war zone.
Yeah.
And
That's
what we do in a war zone is different. So, people are on top of rooftops, but they know that these drones coming in have lethal, devastating payloads. Here, we don't know that at all. And we're not in a situation where, look, we have the most crowded airspace in these areas. We have GPS, we have people on internet. Um, there just aren't a lot of options like we would have in another war zone where we have an imperative. And we
yeah.
also tend not to have those things like, you know, the most crowded airspace in the practically the world is like right here in the Northeast.
Yeah. And you mentioned Keystone Cop, and I kind of love that you said that because if you had to ask a 10-year-old what would you do to figure out what's up in the air, they'd be like, send up your own drone and go find out what it is. But
Yeah.
this necessarily doesn't have any national security implications. But you're very concerned, Beth, that if the US doesn't get its counter drone technology sort of in order, we're going to have a bigger problem. Talk me through why you think there are national security ramifications to this.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that this is what is happening in the Northeast, although there could be at some point, or maybe there are here some foreign adversaries, although there's been talk that that's not the case. But look, we had last December at Langley Air Force Base where the F-22s are based, sensitive fighter aircraft. And this happened for 17 days flying really high, 1,500 to 4,000 feet in the air, quite large, persistent. One general said it was like hearing a lawnmower. Like, so they could hear these things and they really didn't know how to deal with it. And they were limited also in their authorities. They can't necessarily just shoot things down. And it's hard to shoot these down. But we've had an arrest last week in California. He was arrested because he flew over Vandenberg, now no longer Air Force Base, Space Force Base,
Space Force, right?
during the launch of NRO satellites on a
Yeah.
SpaceX rocket.
Yeah.
And then we had the arrest last year of another Chinese national in Virginia. That was in July. He's serving 6 months out of a possible 1-year sentence under the Espionage Act. We've had drone sightings over UK bases where US equipment and people are based, over Germany in Ramstein, and as well as some other sensitive places like Rheinmetall, one of the most important defense contractors. Then we had 3 Chinese arrested in South Korea this year for taking hundreds of pictures of US aircraft carrier and our nuclear powered submarine that was visiting, as well as US and South Korean facilities. So don't tell me there's not a pattern here, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
clearly.
there's a lot of smoke and a lot of sparks actually. So
Yeah.
so there's definitely stuff going on here that is, to me, national security.
Yeah. Beth, you were the first President Trump's daily briefer, and spent a lot of time sort of understanding what officials really need to understand about these issues when they're trying to make decisions. This is a tough one because there isn't necessarily an easy answer, but you said in comments that we included in the Cypher Briefs open source report that you feel like it's time to get a commission going on this. Is that the next step, do you think?
As long as I'm not on it.
Don't volunteer yourself.
But
Yes.
yes, I do. I actually do. Now, there's new legislation. I just spent the last half hour reading this legislation that there's a bill before Congress that's a counter UAS bill that takes care of some of this. But I have to say, reading this, Suzanne, it's like, oh, and then you're going to have to coordinate between the FAA and the Attorney General, and they have to make sure that there's not a threat to airspace or to communications. And it's like, oh my gosh, what would we do in an emergency, right? I mean, it still looks like to me, and this is what happens with cyber, as you know, we have in our system today in America, we are not designed in terms of authorities and regulations for adversaries coming into our domestic space.
Yeah.
And that's what we need to work on, just like we did with NCTC many years ago, what we've done with the Cyber Solarium.
Yep, National Counterterrorism Center, that's right. Beth Sanner, I think you just volunteered yourself for the new commission studying counter drones in the United States. And I think I'm going to go for the moment with the 10-year-old solution to this, which is send up your own drones and go figure out what they're doing. Thank you so much for
Absolutely.
taking the time to talk to us. It's always a pleasure to see you, Beth.
Great seeing you. Talk to you soon.
You probably already know that the Cypher Brief works with deeply experienced experts on global and national security to help put context around today's headlines. But did you also know that the Cypher Brief produces a daily report that keeps you up to speed on national and global security stories that are impacting businesses around the world? Like the President's Daily Brief, the Cypher Brief's open source report should be your first read of the day to stay ahead of the national and global security stories impacting your world. Become a subscriber and get the report for free. Subscribe at thecypherbrief.com.
It's not just unidentified flying drones that U.S. officials are concerned about. About 6 months ago, government officials were alerted to a highly sophisticated espionage operation playing out against U.S. telecommunications companies. Now, you know a cyber attack is pretty bad when some 6 months after a breach is detected, hackers are still believed to be operating inside of the systems. This is the case with Salt Typhoon. I sat down with Jen Easterly, the director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, better known as CISA, to talk about this particular espionage operation and why it's raising so many red flags in Washington and why she thinks it's just the tip of the iceberg. Why don't we just jump into the fun stuff and talk top threats first? I'm sure if there are two words you wish you had never heard of, they might be Salt Typhoon. Both CISA and the FBI have said that spies linked to China are still inside U.S. telecommunication systems, even though it's been 6 months now since the government began investigating. There's an active cyber safety review board taking this on now to really better understand it. What can you tell us about what you've learned in the last 6 months and about how much the investigation might be able to teach all of us?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's great to be with you. You can tell you're with the Cypher Brief when you say, let's start out with something fun and talk about the most serious threats to the nation. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, this is our life, right? I do have to say at the outset, I wish I hadn't ever heard any of these names like, Volt Typhoon, Salt Typhoon, Midnight Blizzard, Tempest Panda, any of these names, and you probably know where I'm going on this, that really glorify these villains that frankly want to do enormous harm to the United States of America. And so I'm on a mission to try and rename some of these bad actors to things like Weak Weasel and Doofus Dingo. I gave a talk on this at Black Hat, but anyway, I digress. So the way that I talk about this Typhoon series, which is really, we're talking about PRC cyber actors. And I think it's important to recognize the trajectory of this threat from China. And, many who've been in this business for a long time will recall that some 10, 15 years ago, even as we were looking to develop the plans for and then to build US Cyber Command, the big threat from China was all about data theft, espionage, intellectual property theft. And certainly we continue to see that with this latest intrusion campaign into telecommunications infrastructure. But to me, the big story from the last couple years that everyone should be paying attention to, businesses large and small, critical infrastructure owners and operators, is really about the actor that is known as Volt Typhoon, that has been working to burrow into our most sensitive critical infrastructure, not for espionage, but rather for disruption or destruction in the event of a major crisis in the Taiwan Strait. So this is a world where a war in Asia could see very real impacts to the lives of Americans across our nation, with attacks against pipelines, against water facilities, against transportation nodes, against communications, all to induce societal panic and to deter our ability to marshal military might and citizen will. And that is a very real, not a theoretical threat. And we know it because our hunt teams working with federal partners and industry and have gone into certain entities. We've identified these actors. We've helped the private sector eradicate them. But we think what we've seen to date is really just the tip of the iceberg. And that's why we've been so focused on talking about the importance of resilience. You know, we can not architect systems for complete prevention. We need to architect them for an ability to adapt, to be able to deal with disruption, to respond, to recover, and to really prepare for that. And I think that's an important ongoing message, and something, if I get an opportunity to talk to my successor about, the importance of businesses really embracing cyber risk as a business risk, as a matter of good governance, and recognizing that resilience is absolutely critical.
Yeah, I definitely want to touch on a lot of the things that you just brought up during our conversation, but I want to kind of talk about a different challenge for just a minute. You know, a recent alert encouraged people who aren't already using encrypted messaging apps to start using them. And you're talking about everybody. It feels like we're at a point where the general public really needs to have a better understanding of cyberspace and how it touches their everyday lives. It's no longer something where we can get into the weeds and use the acronyms and the names and all of that. It feels like we're living in a different world. How are you thinking now about how to make cyber more accessible to more Americans and some of those small businesses too?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've been trying to do that for 3.5 years, so hopefully there's been some progress. You know, when I think about the key initiatives that we've been focused on at CISA, so certainly having those discussions with CEOs and C-suite executives and board members about the importance of corporate cyber responsibility, really embracing cyber risk as a core business risk and as a matter of good governance. So that's sort of one piece of it. Second piece of it, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about this, is this idea of the need for technology vendors to design and build and test and deliver technology that is that prioritizes security. For decades and decades, vendors have been pushing out products that have prioritized speed to market and features over security. And frankly, that's why we have cybersecurity. It's all about a bolt-on. And so we've been working really, really hard with our partners. Frankly, we had a pledge that we unveiled at RSA. We had 68 companies sign that. We're now at over 250. And this is becoming a movement. And I think one that's really, really important. I'm not so naive to think this is change that we're going to catalyze in days, weeks, months, or even a year, but getting this movement started and getting the momentum so that companies understand what they need to do to build secure products. And importantly, consumers need to do to demand those secure products, right? You need that consumer choice, that purchasing power to also help drive that. So that's a really important part. But to your specific question, Suzanne, we have also really tried to champion the basics of cyber hygiene, and that's through our Secure Our World campaign. Folks might have seen all of our Cyber Schoolhouse Rock PSAs, public service awareness announcements, and this is really about getting the American people to understand the basic things that they need to do to keep themselves safe, their family, small businesses, and it's those 4 things, right? Installing updates, making sure you turn on automatic updates, complex unique passwords for your sensitive accounts, ideally a password manager, so you really only have to remember one complex password. Making sure that your employees and even yourself are trained to recognize and report phishing. That's even more important these days because AI has raised the bar on the sophistication of social engineering. And then finally, and I think everybody knows my favorite, multi-factor authentication. So those 4 basic things that we've been advocating for can prevent 98% of cyber attacks, is what the research shows. You know, it's the brushing your teeth, the washing your hands of cyber. And the alerts that we've been putting out on secure communications I think you saw something that my head of cybersecurity, Jeff Green, said, and frankly, we're working on putting something out through our platform, but I've been writing a lot about this on social media, LinkedIn specifically. Anybody that knows Bob Lord, who's a senior technical advisor here at CISA, fantastic teammate, he talks about this a lot, but absolutely, end-to-end encryption. If you want to ensure that your communications are secure, your texts, your voice comms, it's important for folks to understand what they need to do, and end-to-end encrypted comms are the best way to do it. You can pick your platform. Obviously, from an enterprise perspective, there are some rules in place in terms of data retention, so companies need to understand what the options are. But at the end of the day, the encrypted comms piece is incredibly important, particularly in a world where we know that our adversaries have attempted to and succeeded in exploiting our telecommunications. And so, and as you mentioned at the outset, we're working closely with the telecommunications companies that have been impacted as they are working to understand this issue and remediate it. And that will be work that the Cyber Safety Review Board also undertakes. At this point in time, as we're working through what's called the Unified Command Group, CISA, FBI, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and others, our top priority, frankly, is working with the victims of this campaign and ensuring that these victims and their sensitive data are protected and held confidential. So that's our top priority right now. But of course, understanding this campaign and then really having the board make recommendations under the auspices of the department about how to prevent this type of a campaign in the future, I think will be very important for the next administration to pick up the baton on that.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the Secure by Design principles. You announced them last year. It's great to hear more than 200 companies have now signed on, and how you see that evolving both from the opportunities and some of the challenges for whoever follows you in this role. But let me ask you about ransomware. It's still a massive problem. I think 3 or 4 years ago, Kevin Amandia said to me ransomware was the threat of the year, and I feel like it keeps showing up at the top of that board year after year. It's not getting any better, it's evolving. How are you thinking about protecting businesses from ransomware now? And I'm really interested to know how your views on it have changed since you've been in the director role at CISA.
Yeah, it continues to be a big problem. I will tell you, anecdotally, we believe it continues to be a big problem. But until we get the cyber incident reporting for critical infrastructure into place sometime next year, we really won't have an idea of what the full range of the ransomware ecosystem is, because I'm sure there are a lot of entities that have had a ransomware attack and it hasn't been reported. And it really has been a scourge. We have seen impacts that we know about on businesses large and small. And since I came into this job, we've been focused on this through our stopransomware.gov, one-stop shop of all the resources, working with the FBI as our close teammates, with the Joint Ransomware Task Force, working with the Ransomware Vulnerability Warning Pilot to help entities understand where they may have external facing vulnerabilities that we know are being exploited by ransomware actors, our pre-ransomware notification initiative, where we have actually put out over 3,600 warnings to entities in the country, across the world, to prevent them from having a ransomware attack. And so we are doing a lot of work on this. But look, it's very tied to this issue around secure by design. These ransomware actors are not using exotic, unknown, previously unknown vulnerabilities to be able to exploit these entities. They're using well-known public vulnerabilities generally, and essentially it's because many of these entities are using technology that has not been built to be secure. You know, oftentimes we'll say, well, these entities didn't do X, Y, and Z. And that's a piece of it, depending on, the entity and who they are and their level of security team and how much investment they've done. I'm not absolving entities necessarily of their responsibility to keep their customers safe. But at the end of the day, I think we should stop looking at the victims and saying, why didn't you patch that piece of technology? And really ask the question, why did that piece of technology require so many patches? And so I think if we come at it, it's multiple levers, right, Suzanne? Secure by design is not going to solve the problem. But I do think going upstream, ensuring that the technology that we rely upon every day for our critical infrastructure that powers our lives through the devices that we count on to run our lives, if that is built specifically to drive down the number, dramatically drive down the number of flaws and defects, we will see a world that is much more secure. And then I think we will see a decrease in the impact of ransomware attacks. And we'll actually be able to start measuring that once we have a baseline established by the implementation of CIRCIA, the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act.
Yeah, the time horizon on this is really fascinating. Let me ask you, since you've been in this role, have you seen the private sector's willingness to share information with the government, which has always been a touchy subject? Have you seen it increase? Have you seen those bonds of trust that are needed in order to be effective in this partnership really strengthen? How would you describe it?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the reasons I came back into government, because I was in government for a while, 4.5 years at Morgan Stanley, and felt like I knew government very well when I left, having served in the military, in the intelligence community at NSA, at the White House. And looking back at government from the private sector, it was very hard to discern how to effectively collaborate with the government, because we saw so many different actors telling us different things. There was a real lack of coherence. And that is something that I have really tried to champion along with my awesome teammates here. And that was aided and abetted by great work done by the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. I saw Frank on here earlier, and many of the authorities that CISA got as a result of the recommendations to include the Joint Cyber Planning Office, which we set up early in my tenure as the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative. I don't think we can underestimate what a paradigm shift this is, right? At the end of the day, we are asking companies, and if you're a big company, you probably have a big legal team. I know we did when I was at the bank, and they are very focused on making sure that you are reducing risk as much as possible. And frankly, oftentimes saying, no, don't provide that information, or, that may end up hurting your reputation if you're transparent about saying what happened. And so we are really asking 3 things. First, for any business that is a critical infrastructure owner or operator to recognize that a threat to one is a threat to many. Because given the connectivity, the interdependence, the vulnerability, the underpinning of some very complex supply chains, a threat to one provider is oftentimes a threat to many. And we're seeing that with respect to telecommunications infrastructure, certainly. And so it can't just be about self-preservation. It really has to be a focus on collaboration, in particular with the government. But then the second point is there also needs to be a recognition that even as we're asking the private sector to work closer with the government and to provide information, the government has to be coherent. The government has to be responsive and transparent, and for God's sakes, to provide value, right? Just asking for information and then not providing something back, saying that, this was useful, this was not useful. How can I enrich this with information? How can we work together to plan, to reduce risk in an operational way? So that's really important, kind of mutual expectations of adding value. And then the third, it has to be a frictionless experience as much as possible, right? It has to be about scalable platforms, whether that's using different communications platforms, not just this sort of serial email, things like Slack and other things. And that's what we have tried to build through the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative. We started out with 10 companies. We're now at over 350. over 50 different communications channels where we are sharing information, enriching it with what we know from federal government perspective, and then planning against some of the most serious threats to the nation. And we've seen this used successfully, whether it's very early on the threat of Log4j, then on the Shields Up campaign around Russian retaliation on U.S. critical infrastructure, planning efforts around the Volt Typhoon work, focus on pipelines, focus on ransomware with the Joint Ransomware Task Force, and then even with JCDC AI, where we've had real success bringing together generative AI companies and technology companies to plan against a major incident against generative AI companies. And early next year, we're excited to put out the playbook, the incident response playbook that we've been working on. So look, I do think it's been going well, but this is a major paradigm cultural shift, and getting companies that are sometimes competitors to work together from a collective defense perspective is going to continue to be a project. But I've been really, really pleased to see a lot of our great teammates in the private sector come to the table to focus on what they can do, particularly as a critical infrastructure owner-operator, to ensure the collective defense of the nation.
Finally, today, a sneak peek at the latest dead drop. For those familiar with espionage and tradecraft, you know that a dead drop is a location to secretly pass information without a face-to-face meeting. Well, subscribers at the Cipher Brief can pick up a dead drop report every Friday at thecipherbrief.com. But I want to give you a little sneak peek into this week's intelligence collection. As we heard from CISA Director Jen Easterly, you know a cyber attack is pretty bad when 6 months after the U.S. government discovers it, hackers are still inside the system. This is video of NSA Director General Timothy Hawk speaking at this year's Cipher Brief Threat Conference. But at an event put on by the Paley Center in New York last week, General Hawk said that Beijing is widely believed to be behind the breach known as Salt Typhoon. Now, the headline here, though, might just be the answer that Hawk gave under questioning by New York Times reporter David Sanger when he said that Salt Typhoon is not the highest-end operation we've seen. He, of course, didn't elaborate, but if there's something worse out there, we'd sure like to know what it is. That's it for this episode of The World Deciphered. If you're looking for more deeply experienced, expert-level reporting on national security and global security issues, I invite you to join us Monday through Friday at thecipherbrief.com. That's also where you're going to find a daily open source report that doesn't just tell you what's happened in the world in the last 24 hours related to national security, but it also brings you expert insights to help you put those events into context. We're pretty proud of it. I hope you'll check it out at thecipherbrief.com. I'm Suzanne Kelly. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time right here on The World Deciphered.